Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Kesh American Knowledge Team meeting, another beautiful Sunday afternoon. And as you know, we just finished a conference in China, the Sanya conference. Very remarkable things happened there, not the least of which is that the elite of the scientific community got a chance to witness firsthand some of the benefits of the technology. But this is not exclusive. It's not an exclusive club. We're all part of this because we're all part of the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings of Plasma Science. We're discussing basic transition, and today's session has to do with selection. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is April the 28th of 2024, and this is the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we have, through the encouragement of many of the communities around the planet, begun these basic teaching series. And as I say, a lot of credit must be given to the Brazilian community for not only organizing, but also encouraging the continued operation of this. And they have certainly manifested into quite the force. And this is going to be, shall we say, transmitted right around the world. And the benefits thereof will be hopefully everlasting. Today we're going to discuss selection because many of us are wondering who are the chosen ones and who did the choosing, and what does it mean to be chosen. So somewhere, someplace, there had to be a criteria for this selection. And a lot had to do with the motivation. So in some cases, you may be selected for nefarious purposes, and other selections may have to do with promotion, So say, for instance, you're applying for a job and someone has to make a selection. And so the question is, how do they make that selection? So the obvious answer, of course, is that the profile of the applicant matches the requirement of the job. So there has to be a merging of the two fields. And this is part of the selection process. And we have to understand this. It's not a unilateral thing. So when we are having this problem getting on this plasma highway because we're still stuck on this hesitancy highway, we have to understand that we are only working on the lowest energy state. And we all know how life is very hard. And we say it gets much easier when you get up on the horse. Well, that's okay, but that's not the only way to go. So we really have to exercise caution because we have to be careful of what we select. And it becomes very important. And you say, well, is it really that important? And how is it going to affect my life? Well, that was the question that I had because all I wanted to do was to restore the health in my family. But to restore the health of my family, I had to know how the universe was created. And so in book number 1 of Baron Tavakoli book, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter, it discusses this, how the matter, dark matter and antimatter gets together and creates this matter state. And what we are looking at is the creation of matters. But what I'd like to discuss today is how are these matters selected? And so the way that we see how they arrived here, of course, is with the structure of light. And so in book number 2, it shows that we go from one matter state to another matter state, and there is that connection, but it still doesn't talk about the individual structure. So therefore, book number 3 talks about the origin of the universe, where you have the one matter splits up into the other two matters. And so that would be the origin of the universe, where we have our own little man's universe, and then we have a sister universe that is derived from that matter. What we're going to talk about today is the exact opposite, where the two combine into one. So this is all something that we're all going through, and it's available to us. We talked about the transmutation preparation sessions, and because this has to do with how matter is created and how matter moves from one place to another. And this is a series of 6 monthly classes, and next May, on the 17th, will be the 5th such class in that series. So I hope if you haven't enjoyed these sessions, please consider it. Because this is all part of our mission, which is to bring peace on earth. And how can you do that without having one planet, one nation, and one race for justice and world peace? And we've tried that for 323 weeks in a row. And we are seeing phenomenal progress because it's extended beyond the basic meeting that we have every Tuesday. This is now a daily activity in all the corners of the earth, because we're all searching for outer space. This has never been properly defined. And we know that if we get into outer space, we can get on that plasma highway to that little piece of pie in the sky and beyond. But that pie in the sky that we have is that little tiny red dot in the right-hand corner. And so we don't even get to see the rest of the pie. And beyond that, what about the rest of the universe? And you say, wow, you know, the scale and the magnitude and the change is phenomenal. So how do we get there? Well, the best way is to get on that plasma highway, but we're not there yet. We're still on the transmission highway. And the transmission highway, as we said, is the lowest energy state. And we've worked hard to understand that transmission highway because it has some limitations. And so we want to get into the transition highway so that we can overcome these limitations. So it's, shall we say, one step up. And there is a range in the universal embodiment, that range. And so we see that where we are and how we're moving along, and we see how big everything is. So one of the things we have to determine that the speed of light is the fastest transmission. And we question if that is true, because, you know, the faster you go, the bigger you get. Because, I mean, let's face it, if where you are and we're so tiny, and we look at the rest of the universe and it's so big to get there, then we also have to be big. But, you know, both of these have been disproven. So please check your baggage. And let's get into the universal embodiment pie chart, which is really what we're trying to figure out. And we question if the speed of light is the constant transmission. And is the universe 70% hydrogen? And when you look at where you are and you say, well, show me the map, well, that's okay where you are, and that's okay to what you can see. But what's going on beyond that? Because what you see is only really the MAGRAPH pie chart, isn't it? Because that is the creation of matter. And so that MAGRAPH pie chart is only telling you that little piece of pie that you have, but there, and maybe we could say that as 1/3 of the pie. But what about the other 2/3? And they are also not the same third. 1/3 is not the same as the other third. So when we look at the gravitational confirmation, we have to understand that there's energy coming from the sun and the energy coming from the earth. And it's the amalgamation of these two energies which come together and give us this gravitational spectrum. And the original MAGRAV gravitational spectrum was the hydrogen, and it had to be the hydrogen because that's how we get from one to the other. And so that becomes the basis and the foundation of energy in motion. And so we have this principal matter, which comes as an energy pack. And it doesn't only come from one side, it comes from many different sides. And what is the nature of this energy pack? Because not all energy packs are the same. So all we can just say is that there is a difference in energy packs, but what is that criteria and how do we select that? And isn't that always the question? Because let's face it, we're getting energy from the sun, not the same energy, and the energy from the earth, not the same energy. And we're getting this principal interaction of these two energies. And so not only do we have the sun and trying to contain its energy, and at the same time sharing its energy with the earth, which is trying to contain its energy and sharing its energy with the sun. And so we find that this energy in motion is actually a two-way street. And then we find that we have additional gravitational confirmation because we also have an oxygen spectrum, kind of different from the hydrogen spectrum. And is the oxygen spectrum really a combination of a bunch of hydrogen spectrum? So when we look at the nature of water and we see that the water itself is an energy parceling unit, and it is already in its physicality a combination of hydrogen and oxygen. And it is balanced. It is a MAGRAV and it is round. And how is that possible when you have the two hydrogens trying to balance off the one big fat oxygen? It doesn't seem to make sense because that does not look balanced. And then when we want to get energy in motion, we have to shear one of these electrons off of this water molecule, which leaves a hydroxyl. So we take the one and it splits into two, one of which is a positive hydrogen and the other, which is a negative hydroxyl, which is a combination of oxygen with one hydrogen. And so there was a relationship, and that creates charges. So we have the positive hydrogen and the negative hydroxyl, where the negative gives and the positive takes. But then there are two ways that charges communicate. They can either be flowing or they can be binding. Okay, so what that means is with the creation of the universe, since it exists from energy and that energy is always positive, then the only difference in the charge is actually the motion and the direction of motion. And so when we look at how we travel from one MAGRAV point to another MAGRAV point, we have to see that this energy, which is positive, is actually moving. And is it moving in the same transmission line, or is it moving in a different transmission line for which we have to transition? So isn't that another question? And so we tried to answer that question when we made the cups of life. So the thing about the cups of life is that they were not the cups of pandemic. They were representative of the core space within us, which is a manifestation of our inner space that reflects our emotional strength. And that emotional strength gave us cup 1 and cup 2. So understanding that the cups of life were 2 cups. So 1 cup was the cup of emotion, and 1 cup was the cup of physicality. And the components that we used were very much in physicality. But what we did, we created this Gans radiance, which was manifested inside the cups of life, and which became carbon dioxide Gans, calcium Gans, zinc Gans, copper Gans, water Gans, and amino acid Gans, and even gold Gans can be made in the cups of life. And so we find that how these Ganses come together had to be selected. And we wonder, well, who did the selection? So in understanding kind of what we're talking about, we had to figure out that in order to work on a particular dimension, and being in the physical dimension, the components of the physicality dimension were the X, Y, and Z axis, which involve rotation, polarity, and field strength. And so when we discuss that, that's transmission, transition, and transmutation. So we're discussing the transition and the selection. And that becomes a different dimension, the transition dimension. And then we have only one aspect that we're discussing today, and that's the X-axis transmission dimension. But how can the X-axis transmission dimension also have a transition dimension? Wasn't that supposed to be the domain of the Y-axis? So we find that there are 2 aspects that we have to understand. We have to understand the medium, and we have to understand the message. And is there a conflict? Is there a competition? And so the way we see life on this planet is how 2 forces come together. And so we create these 2 dimensions, the X and the Y dimension. And in that process, we create a force field. And then the rules of engagement is that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. For a lot of us, that's hard to understand because we here like to have the higher strength eat the weaker strength. So this becomes a point of conflict, and our point of view becomes very, very important. But how do we resolve this conflict? So we have to create this other field where the combination of the 2 points of conflict come together and become a point of containment. And for some of us, we don't understand this energy binding because it's very important to have a self-serving energy binding system. But that energy binding system is the same system that you used when you were born. And for some reason, we've abandoned that in our adult life. And so we seek this energy binding to preserve our self-serving system. And we do this at the expense of others. But really, the others also have a need of energy binding for their self-serving process. And they were getting the energy from the same source. But if someone is robbing that energy from them, then they have to supplement that energy. And so the tendency has become to carry on the domino effect. Well, if you're robbing from me, I'll rob from someone else. Alternatively, I can fight you. so that you don't rob from me. And so we create this warmongering thing. And that's how we have been moving along. We have been either lying, cheating, or stealing, or killing for the purpose of self-preservation. So we have, can you hear me?
Alex, you need to take the screen back. There must have been an interruption.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. There was an interruption. I don't know why. Oh, I have to do something else.
We see your screen now.
And do you hear me?
Very well.
Very well. I will carry on then. So this business of capturing the field is what allows us to do the energy binding. But there's always a difference in position. So not only is the energy in motion, but we are in motion as well. So we can do this transmission perpendicular to the ground, but we can also do this transition perpendicular to the ground. So really the question then becomes which ground, and how do we make this selection, and who is it that's making this selection? And so we find that actually we are the last man standing. And what is wrong here? Excuse me one moment. Is that better?
If it's better for you, yes.
Uh-oh. Okay.
It's fine.
All right. So somehow, some way we have to make a selection. And so there are sequences also that we have to abide by. So there's gravitational attraction, which is part of the feedback system, which tells you how good a job you're doing. From the magnetical repulsion system, which is actually part of the feeding system. And as the last man standing, then you're the one who has to make the selection. And in the making of these selections, you can do three things. You can turn on and turn off the feeding. You can increase or decrease the strength of the field, or you can enhance or diminish the positioning. And so you're the one who's doing all the work. And good. So when we look at a field and we say, okay, well, that particular field has three planes by axis. So we said the x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. So that takes care of one dimension. But then there are other dimensions. And how do we know that? Because when we look at the rings of Saturn, we notice two things. One is that the rings are visible. But we also notice that the planet is visible. And we notice that there's a gap between the body of the planet and the body of the rings. So there are gaps. Gap between the planet and the ring. And then we see that there are gaps from one ring to another ring. But what is not explained is why we have manifested rings as opposed to why we have manifested the body of the planet, because the body of the planet is different from the rings. The only thing that we do know is that the rings belong to Saturn and the body belongs to Saturn. So there is a common denominator, but obviously there are different factors which affect this. And interestingly enough, when we look at the side view of Jupiter's rings, we find that we have a flat main ring and a halo inside the main ring and a gossamer ring. So, now all of a sudden we now have a different factor affecting the rings, and we also have gaps between those factors. So this is an entirely different dimension, isn't it? So here we are, we're just trying to talk about the basic transition dimension of the x-axis. So what we had to establish last week was the potentiation of hydrogen to understand that the basic gravitational attraction to this planet had to do with the hydrogen and the oxygen. And so the potentiation of hydrogen and the potentiation of oxygen are actually one and the same. But what we are looking at is the dramatic change in the potentiation of the hydrogen, because that's an important factor. So that's why this is called the potentiation of hydrogen. And so what we see is that scale goes from 1 to 14, and the 7 is the midpoint. And so there is a degree of susceptibility, which takes us from an unstable to a stable format. Well, what we have to understand is that the unstable becomes very simple and the stable format becomes very complex. And so the simple potential of hydrogen is magnetical and the complex is gravitational, because it also includes the oxygen and not just one. We see that each step along the way is not just one step, but it is an order of magnitude. So each step is 10 times compared to the next one. So at 14, that is higher, and at 1, that is lower. So it's either higher by 10 times or lower by 10 times, and every step along the way. So we understand that there is such a thing as natural selection, obviously, but it seems to conflict with man-made regulation. And the reason for that is because we're not clear who are the chosen ones, because we're not clear who does the choosing. So we have to figure out this process of selection. And so if we were to change the pH table and substitute it for the potentiation of selection, then maybe we could say, well, the natural selection is extremely efficient and very gravitational, and the man-made manipulation is obviously very simple. So, when we try and create a condition, we think in very simple terms. But when we look at our body, it's very complex. We have over 70 trillion cells in our body, and each of them has a potentiation of selection, which is determined by natural regulation. So natural regulation can handle over 30 trillion complexities. Man-made manipulation is extremely simple. So we can look at that as the potentiation of selection. But we have a range anomaly here, and that is that both ends of the spectrum are extreme. Well, how can they both be extreme and both be different? And so we find that in the midpoint, we have the balance point between the two extremes. And that balance point is what we call a maggrav, which is the balance point between the magnetical gravitational field forces. So the midpoint is the perfect balance. Well, what happens if we're slightly below the midpoint? Less than perfect balance, right? And so things have to change. And we know that things do change because when we look at the Earth space range details, we find that there are many different elements. And so when we've talked about the hydrogen spectrum and the oxygen spectrum, but look, we've got all of these things, everything from iron to calcium, and that's just a short list here. And so there is a range, and somehow these also fall within the range. So therefore, the range has to move, or the selection within the range has to move. It cannot always be balanced, but of course it can. Because if it wasn't balanced, well, you wouldn't have copper or zinc. You'd have a mishmash. So it is balanced. So there has to be some kind of selection, but not at the midpoint. And so we find that this all becomes part of the maggrav feeding conversion, where energy is coming in and more is coming in through the force fields of attraction, which we call absorption. And so these fields are gravitational. And then to maintain that, we emit through repulsion magnetical fields which go out and more go out. And so we have this balance of this maggrav, which we call a planet. And we see on this planet, not only do we have a whole bunch of elements, but we have a whole bunch of humanity. We have a whole bunch of vertical people and horizontal people and a whole bunch of different conditions. And so they're all kind of different. And then when you look at the potentiation of hydrogen, you say, well, wait a second. If the midpoint is balanced, then how do we have all these other things? So we realize that not only is the pH table reference to water splitting, and the splitting of the water pH totals always 14, but the materialization selection is also the same. So for instance, in Chile, we have copper, in Indonesia, we have gold, and in the Middle East, we have oil. And so for these three examples, we can be location specific. But how do we achieve this location positioning? Because somehow, some way, we had to make this selection. And then we also have to understand that these are not the only locations on the planet for these specific products. So the criteria for achieving this location positioning of these three would also have to be in place if any of these three were in a different location. So that materialization selection then would have to take other things into account. Not so simple, is it? So when we look at the pH of water, and if we were to think of it as a zipper, where if the water becomes more acidic, so deviating from 7 down to 6, that becomes your acidic water, it is mandatory to produce a balancing pH. In other words, a pH of 8, alkaline water as well. So that the pH of 6 and the pH of 8, well, that equals 14. And if we were to continue that and have a pH of 5, then the balancing pH would have to be 9. 9 and 5 being 14. And then if we went down to 4, then the balancing pH would have to be 10. And so what we realize is that not only do we have potentiation layers, but we have a forced selection. In other words, if we create a pH of 5 and 1, there has to be somewhere, somehow, an offsetting pH of 9. And do we know where that is? Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. The point of the matter is that it's a two-way transmission. So we've studied two dimensions and two-way streets and seen two directions on these streets and vehicles of two different sizes and different variables and even two lanes on these streets. But now we realize that we need to have two selections in order for us to have this transmission. And that's a minimum of two selections. Because if we were to say, well, there's copper in Chile, then we could say, well, that's the only selection. But if we find that there's copper in Montana, then that's a different selection. So that has different choices. So this whole talks about relationships. So when we talk about a MAGRAV relationship, that is a balance between the magnetic and gravitational field forces. But when we're looking at the relationship between the scientific community and the spiritual community, we find that the scientific community is battling the conservation of magnetic fields versus the conservation of energy. And the spiritual community is trying to balance off between the spirit and the soul, and suggesting that the spirit is the motor of the soul. So the plasma science now adds to that knowledge. It's another criteria that adds to that. So when we talk about the conservation of energy, the law of conservation of energy states that energy can be neither created nor destroyed, only converted from one form of energy to another. So if we can create a simple formula, and there has to be a balance on one side and a balance on the other side, and there's a relationship. So if we look at the one side, K1 is the initial kinetic energy, and U1 is the initial potential energy. So the balance between the kinetic and potential energy gives us one side of the equation. Well, isn't that interesting? Because the balance between the kinetic and potential energy on the other side of the equation also gives us a balance. The difference, however, being that K2 is the final kinetic energy and U2 is the final potential energy. So in other words, as the kinetic energy changes on one side, it changes on the other side in the opposite direction. And as the potential energy on one side changes, it changes in the opposite direction on the other side. And then we find that the kinetic and potential energy on one side, total, is constant. And the kinetic and potential energy total on the other side is constant. And so the constants of the energy on the left side is equal to the constants of the energy on the right side. So the conservation of energy means that the energy needs to be constant. Okay, so how do we change the strength? So if we were to create a potentiation of strength chart, we find that there's a weaker energy on one side and a stronger energy on the other side. And, you know, one of the reasons we go to sleep is so that we can restore our energy. So we might find that we're going to be very strong in the morning and very weak in the evening. And the weaker we get, the closer we get to going to sleep. And so the strength is reflected as the initial potential energy, and the weakness is represented by the final potential energy. In other words, there is no potential energy at the end. It's bedtime. But we find that the relationship is magnetical and gravitational. And so the susceptibility of how much energy you have is going to be determined by the relationship between the strength and the weakness. But in the plasma rule, don't forget that the strong feeds the weaker. I want to tell you a little story about my grandma. Well, I had two grandmas, and there was a battle. One was bad and one was good. And grandmas like to cook, right? But they had two different recipes. And the bad grandma couldn't cook. She had bad food, bad recipe. And the good grandma had really, really a good food recipe. In fact, it was so good that I became highly prejudiced when I was looking at people and how they prepared food. And I would always compare them to my grandma's recipe, because my grandma's recipe was outstanding. So, and that's, you could say that that's bragging, but it was an actual very good measure. And so it's not to say that my grandma was the best cook in the world. It's just that she had a very good recipe. And she maybe didn't do us any favors. And all the other cooks out there who have good food recipes maybe didn't do us any favors. Because the problem, you see, is that the good food makes you want to eat. And it causes a food addiction. Whereas the bad food, well, let me tell you how bad it was. It was repulsive. And my mother was very gracious. She did this bait and switch. She distracted the bad grandma at the dinner table. And I was pleading with my mother that I couldn't eat the food. And my mother was just eating it like it was good food. And I was going to get very, very sick eating this food. And I just wasn't going to go through with it. My mother was very angry, but she didn't want to display her anger in front of grandma. So she distracted grandma. And in that process of distracting grandma, she picked up my bowl of soup and she dumped it in a planter. And I really feel sorry for that planter today. Poor planter had got the bad food recipe. And so when grandma came back to the table, she said, "Oh, you finished? Oh, that's good. How did you like it?" "Oh, yes, grandma, it was delicious." "Well, that's great." Well, of course, that was a patent lie. But what was I going to do? So grandma says, "Well, do you want some more?" "Oh, no, I'm full." And mom jumps in and says, "Well, actually we ate before we came here, so we're all quite full, so thank you very much." And that settled that. So when I look back, and I say, well, I like the good grandma, but I didn't like the bad grandma because her recipe was a failure. And we always say that, we can change the past. why can we change the past is because it's a reflection of our attitude. It's a reflection of our prejudice. And so I thought her food was hideous. But the problem wasn't that she had bad food. The problem was that she was not a very good influencer. Because had she been a good influencer and had she been famous and spread this recipe around the world, we might have all overcome our food addiction. So we can measure this taste of the food, which is very important. And if we put it on a pH scale or a PP scale potentiation of taste, we can say, well, the gravitational food is delicious. Well, of course, everybody wants to eat delicious food. Who wants to eat unpalatable food?
Alex, I think we've lost your screen. Let's see if you're still here. Yes. Okay,
I'm not sure what is going on. I'm very sorry.
it's okay. It's just probably one of those mischievous AI systems or something sort of came out to play. We've heard this before already. Oh, there we go.
And I was paying compliments to the Zoom administrators. Anyway, I'll, I'll have to be very careful with the buttons here. So we were talking about taste. And so there was this fabulous marketing campaign. Many of you probably don't remember this. It was about Charlie the tuna, and poor Charlie, and he couldn't understand the difference between good taste and tasting good. You see, because the company that had the marketing campaign selected only the best tuna. And so they were selecting the tuna by tasting good, not by good taste. So, you know, dressing up in a tuxedo and then your finest attire showed good taste, but that didn't get you selected. And so poor Charlie never understood that. And so we see that, we have the same type of thing. And the question then becomes is, well, how did we get selected? And who did the selecting? And if we are just the plasmagen receiver, and we are the manifestation of that plasmagen receiver, then something has happened. And we see that the z-axis is on one side, and on the other side, like the two extremes. So the reception is in the midpoint, and that is the balance point. So it doesn't have to be directly in the midpoint, because there are other factors that come into play. But in terms of the physical manifestation, it does have to be in the midpoint. So why am I suggesting that this is so different? Because there's 8 billion of us on this planet, and we're all different. So where do we get this influence from? And of course, there was another genius marketing campaign where you had to keep your eyes on your fries. And these were called French fries, and I hope that's not discriminatory, but the main thing about these fries is that they were tasting good. So the reason people would choose these fries is because of the taste. Excellent marketing campaign, very successful. But it reflected something, because we find that the food is controlled by the Food and Drug Administration, and I often wonder, you know, why do they control the marketing campaigns and the influence selection? And then I realized, well, food is an addiction, thanks to my good grandmother. Drugs are an addiction, and so addictions also become an addiction. So these marketing campaigns and their influencers entrench our addiction selection choices, don't they? So it's too bad my bad grandma couldn't be a good influencer. But we have another food duality anomaly, and that has to be that on the plate, the food is in a physical state. And we see the food on the plate, and it looks good, doesn't it? And we can take the food and put it in our mouth, and we can see the food in our mouth. It doesn't look as good as it is on the plate, but it is not in a physical state. It's in a plasmatic state. And so what we are concerned with is, does the food taste good? And so the natural implication is that that food that tastes good is also good for you. But is that food good for you? Or is that food that you're eating selected by the influencer, and you just go along with it? Because one of the ways to improve the quality and taste of the food is to add sugar. And so that was one of the things that my good grandma limited. She was able to manage an excellent recipe without sugar. And as I was looking at a lot of restaurant owners and influencers and how they promote their recipe and how good they are and how good it tastes, and we find that they use sugar a lot. A lot. And so I always measure that to my good grandmother's recipe. And I find that if someone is using excessive sugar to make their recipe taste good, then they're really not that good a cook. And we see that the composition of sugar has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And sugar is very important because sugar gives us energy, and we know that. And I want you to note that the geometric structure of sugar is in a pentagon. There's another form of sugar, high fructose corn syrup. We find it in energy drinks. And so if we understand what fructose is, it's phosphorylated. Fructose is phosphorylated fructose. High fructose corn syrup is also known as glucose fructose, isoglucose, and glucose fructose syrup. It's a sweetener made from cornstarch. And the starch is broken down into glucose by enzymes. And studies into the health risks have been conducted in many countries, and it's widely agreed that it contributes to obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease, but is not actually banned anywhere. So we have a direct link to the energy, and energy drinks are very popular, aren't they? And isn't that one of the reasons that we eat, is to get that energy? But we can't process fructose. We eat glucose. It's the glucose that is phosphorylated and phosphorylated into fructose. the phosphorylated fructose is something that our digestive system does. But we can't eat it and process it. That's the problem. So when we look at the phosphorylation and what happens, we see that there's some kind of transition from the brain to the body. And in that process, there's a crossover where the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And then in that process of the phosphorylation comes the manifestation of the body. And so that becomes always the part of the transportation system crossing over the blood-brain barrier. So if we were to look at the potentiation of fructose, we can see that our food and the natural sugars are embedded in the glucose in the food that we eat. And then through the potentiation of fructose, it becomes magnetical. And that becomes part of the energy that we derive. And so the energy that we get comes from the food that we eat. But not only, that's what we have been influenced. And speaking of influence, coffee is a very good influencer. And this came up with another discussion. I don't know if anyone's been to a seance and knows what a medium is. And a medium basically occupies the same body in front of an audience. And that body literally changes the inflection in its voice. It changes the way it talks, and it changes the way it thinks. And so it's using the same body, but it's a different being. And we know that because we hear the difference. But this particular medium that I'm referring to couldn't stand the taste of coffee and was complaining bitterly that the other person occupying that body loved coffee. And so the coffee, and many of us like to drink it, liked the coffee, but the medium didn't like the coffee because it didn't like the taste. And so we see that there's a difference between the US and Canada, where coffee black is food. And in the US, they don't call it black, they call it regular. But in Canada, regular is coffee with cream and sugar. And cream and sugar like leather soup. It's hard to digest. And in Canada, we like cream and sugar so much that we double up. And so very often we order a coffee double. That's double cream and double sugar. And so when we look at the medium and we say, well, the medium is the message, clearly that's false. Because the medium is the messenger. It's the medium that told us he doesn't like the coffee. Light is the message. The light is the energy. The light is the message. And there's a popular YouTube video called the Action Lab. And he did an experiment where he shone a laser light through a medium. That medium was water. And so the light came in from the glass outside, went through the glass, and it was a straight line of light. And then he went down to the bottom of the container and something happened. The light was curved. And so he disclosed the secret of why the light was curved. And that was because he had dissolved sugar in the water, but he didn't stir it. So there was a gradient progressive gradient that there was more and more sugar as it went to the bottom of the tank. And why? Because sugar was more dense than the water, so it sank to the bottom. And when he shone the light through the sugar that was in the water, the light curved. Well, isn't that interesting? Because when you're looking at the water, you can't tell the difference between the water with less sugar and the water with more sugar. And we know that is true because if you've ever taken a sugar cube and put it in a hot cup of tea, you would see that that sugar would disappear. But you knew that that sugar was in the tea because you could taste it. So the speed of light would have had to be the same in the water, and the sugar water would have to be the same. So the reason that the water affected the light was not because the light was slower. It's because the light had farther to go. The light had to go through the more dense water. So now we know the impact of sugar on density. And now we know the impact of density on light. And so now we understand that there's a relationship between the wavelength and the frequency, and the speed of light is constant. But the speed of light is not the same color. But when we find that the balance between the wavelength and frequency in each color, that balance is the same. It is constant. It is constant whether the light is red or whether the color is violet, and all the colors in between. And there's a gradient change in the relationship between the wavelength and frequency. So both had to come and be part of the selection process of the light. So if we say that the speed of light is constant, then how do we get the different frequency? Well, the travel then has to go around more times. The more times it goes around, the higher the frequency. And how can the light travel more than another? And that is by reducing the diameter of the orbit. So we have color orbitals. And so we find the blue light is at a higher frequency, the red light is at a lower frequency. So therefore, the blue light must be closer to the core, and the red light must be closer to the outer orbit. And therefore, the blue light becomes gravitational and the red light becomes magnetical. And we know that the speed of light is constant. So when we use to determine the pH density, well, isn't that interesting? We use a pH tester that reflects this light, and sure enough, we find that the acid, which is 1, is red, and the alkaline is violet. And since gravity seeks density, and we find that oxygen is more dense than hydrogen, so that's why we find the difference, and we call it the pH density. Obviously, the acidic side is less dense, and the acidic side is oily, and the alkaline side is wet. But the acid side pH plus the alkaline side pH always totals 14. It's always constant. So therefore, if we were to measure things like stupidity, for instance, so we can say, well, the potentiation of stupidity is the balance between those who are stupid and those who are smart. Well, who decides? If you were in a group of stupid people, there would be no stupid people. And conversely, if you were in a group of smart people, there would be no smart people, because there'd be no difference. What about ugliness? Isn't beauty in the eyes of the beholder? So there are beautiful flowers, there are ugly flowers. I made the mistake once of suggesting that one flower was very ugly. I was prejudiced. And then I was reprimanded and told, tell that to the butterfly. Because each flower was serviced by a butterfly. And in the eyes of the butterfly, each flower, whether in my opinion was ugly or beautiful, was beautiful in the eyes of the butterfly. There was no such thing as ugly. And so when we look at the potentiation of physicality, and then if we put it on the same scale, so we can see that the manifestation of the man space is determined by the inner space. And the susceptibility of that physicality is based on the relationship between the magnetical and gravitational field forces. So the susceptibility changes. But the susceptibility changes based on selection. Well, what about the soul? So we see that if we were to graph the potentiation of the soul, we could say, well, the soul of the man is gravitational and the soul of physicality is magnetical. That stands to reason. The soul of the man feeds the soul of physicality. The higher strength feeds the weaker strength. How effective is it? Well, the answer is the susceptibility. And where on the scale is this? Where on the scale is the relationship of the soul of the man and the soul of the physicality? And are those the only two things that we have to take into consideration for the selection? Well, it is if we're looking at the man space, but we have to understand our earth space. And so that's a factor as well. Do we know enough to take that into account as well? So what we need to take into account is that there is a stairway anomaly, because between, say, pH of 5 and pH of 6, there is also a transition going from lower pH to a higher pH. And each step along the way is an order of magnitude. But the net result of going from the lower pH of 5 to the higher pH of 6 is also an order of magnitude. So if we were to compare the higher pH of 6, it seems to be lower than the lower pH of 5. But that all depends on which transmission you're talking about. So if we select 5, we have to understand that automatically there is a 9, because the balance is constant. So by selecting 5, we automatically select 9. It's automatic. It's predetermined. It is forced. You're not going to get 7. 5 and 7 is 12. It doesn't add up. So this affects our transmission susceptibility. And in understanding what is higher and what is lower, we now have to take more into account. And since we're only talking about transmission, then all we're concerned about is on the higher transmission level, if we have a lower pH, we automatically select a corresponding higher pH. And if we're on a lower level, well, we have to do the same thing. So in other words, regardless of which transmission level we're operating on, we have to achieve balance. So the natural selection process of seeking balance is automatic. So this brings us to the potentiation of fear anomaly, because the terrorist fearing is man-made. And so we say, well, with man with his outward courage dares to die. But then there's God fearing. And of course, that is God made. And we say, well, man with the inner courage dares to live. Well, obviously, living and dying are two ends of the spectrum, but the fearing seems to be at both ends of the spectrum, both ends of the extreme. How can both ends of the extreme be the same if one end is magnetical and one end is gravitational? So therefore, our understanding of what is man-made and what is God-made has been influenced. And so we need to remove these influencers, these intermediaries, and understand that if we were to graph the potentiation of fear, we find that man-made fear makes us fearful, and God-made fear makes us fearless. And wherever we are, we're seeking the balance. And when we achieve that balance, and then we can change our dimension. And so we're using the Universal Body Enhancement Spaceships units to deliver food energy and drug energy and addiction energy. And if we can deliver this energy, then we don't need the taste of the food or the injection of the drugs or the dependence on an addiction. So the message delivery is delivered by the messenger. And the energy delivery is delivered by the transmission selection. And the selection delivery comes without intermediaries. You're the one who makes the choices. You're the one who decides the transmission spectrum. You're the one who chooses the spectrum orbitals. So what we're looking at is the transition of transmission spectrums. That is the spectrum to spectrum susceptibility. So there's a superficial surface susceptibility. There's an internal substance susceptibility. So one depends on the physicality and one depends on the substrate, the plasma substrate. And the combination of the two becomes that point of containment. And that point of containment isn't just in our visible spectrum, but it's one step beyond and in either direction. It's in two dimensions, two choices, and these choices come together. And so these transmission orbitals are not a map. The communication only requires an antenna to understand that the release of binding energy precedes the retrieval of beneficial energy. The field release has to precede the field capture, and the giving has to precede the taking. The emission has to precede the absorption. But motion cannot exist without coexistence. because motion itself is a product of existence. So one, motion, and two, coexistence reside in one matter state and the other matter state. So the tuning of the plasma dominant state has to precede the tuning of the physical dominant state. And so when we're looking at these dimension orbitals and we try and find out, well, where is the center? Well, it's not man-space centric, and it's probably not the Earth space centric, is it? You might say it's sun-space centric, but that's not conclusive. We know that the containment is dimension centric, and the proximity to that dimension is also dimension centric. And the nature of the pressure to get there is dimension centric as well. So that all stays the same. So we understand that we have 3 transmission dimensions. And what is the message? And how is that message contained? Well, we have to figure out the transmission dimension selection. And if we're only looking at the feedback summary, which is, what does it sound like? Can I see the light? What's the temperature? How much pressure is there? Oh, look at the luster. Look at the superficiality. What about the laminar containment? Or what about the x-axis transmission dimension transition? Or are we depending totally on the dominance of the taste selection? And Charlie, do you have good taste, or is the taste just in your mouth? So we see the difference between the man-made and the role of man. We get to choose. We get to choose our target point, not only between the gravitational and magnetical field forces of the reality dimension, but also the transition from the manifestation point to the transparency point, where we can go from the gravitational Earth space to the gravitational some other space. So as we understand this, we'll understand how to target our trips to outer space and understand that the matter plasma dimension in the physicality is gravitational. But it's part of the feedback system. It's the plasmatic feed that is magnetical. And we are feedback dominant. So the message feeding becomes a manifestation. And the message feedback also becomes a manifestation. So this tuning has to be between the transmission and the transition, where the selection of one is balanced by the forced selection of another. And it's the resulting selections that feed the manifestation. It's the selection manifestation is predetermined by selected choices of intention. These are not visible. And we will learn more as we develop our research teams with the first cache space plasma research centers. We are now in the post-March 15th of 2024 era of choices. And there's a new selection process that we have to learn. And as we go 535 weeks of knowledge seekers workshops to talk about the greater oneness, how we can transcend the limitations of nuclear science. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, teachings on plasma science. Welcome all the beautiful knowledge seekers. learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. But it requires a world peace treaty, and it requires for you to sign it with true intentions. And we wonder, is man the reactor of a three-dimensional universe? Or can man find heaven through the field transition? Or does man just simply have to go out of his mind to go into outer space? Here we are mining the orbitals of the three dimensions of truth and understanding of natural selection without intermediaries. We select the message transition in various physical transmission dimensions. And that's why the plasma science needs to continue to be delivered daily in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. That's the end of the lesson. I hope you enjoyed this trip. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. And hopefully everyone enjoyed your sharing. I don't have any questions at the moment. Although when you said the food on the grandma's plate, I thought you said the food looks good on the plane. And I was saying, wow, I ordered a steak. I did a few plane flights recently and ordered a steak. It was the size of a credit card and just about that thick as well. So you sort of confused me there, but then I realized it was the grandmother's plate you were talking about. It wasn't a plane at all.
I wonder if when you ordered your steak, if you ordered it rare or well done, or were you kind of clever and just ordered it slightly nano-coated?
No, I didn't. I just made up that story, but I did hear one similar to that where they were, I don't know if they were in first class or what, but he said the steak was the size of a credit card. It may be a little thicker. Okay, let's see if the participants would like to enter the conversation with anything. I noticed we had a couple members of the Universal Council here. There's just one left that I see, but of course we're all Universal Council. I was thinking if there's anything they'd like to add. We still have Lisbeth here.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Not really. Only say thank you so much because the people all the time is increasing the knowledge, all the time sharing the knowledge, and all the time elevating all souls. And please continue. And thank you so much for that. And thank you, Alex. All the time you expand more of knowledge because your explanation is clarifying many things about that. Thank you so much.
Elizabeth, I want to thank you very much for the courage that you're displaying. People just may not understand in general how difficult the road is for you in your particular location. So we're all hoping that you will get much more assistance because, as I said today, the balancing is mandatory. So your efforts will be rewarded. Thank you.
To you, Alex. Thank you to you. We are the soul of the peace. All contribution is big contribution. Thank you, thank you.
Anyone want to come in and ask a question or make a comment or share something about the technology?
Hello, Alex. Hello, Mike.
Yes, Claudia.
I want to make a question for Alex, because I was seeing a video today about cancer, and you completed my knowledge about it. And Mr. Cash said about the emotions, the same you said in this teaching, that we are the creator of our own disease because these emotions. And he said an interesting thing that I didn't listen until today was that have like a spectroscopy Hammond. And I studied today about this, and this spectroscopy measure the elements that in our body it's increase or lower. And Mr. Cash said that use this more than the elements in our blood. And he said more about this, the emotions, the emotions is the point, is the, how can I say? Oh my gosh. The emotions change our salinity, and I think that you explained today change our pH too. So, but about these emotions, how can I know? I have the intentions, and we change all the times the emotions, and much emotions that we have. It's not our own emotions. I think is from our ancestors. So I want to know what you think about how can you control these emotions? How can you know which emotions is doing the effect in our physical body? Because I was thinking about it. We can cure ourselves, but how can I know if my emotion is the right way or not? That's it. Thank you.
Mark, was Claudia cutting out or was I cutting out?
Neither. She wasn't cutting out.
Okay, I
And
seem to.
this is the first time you opened your mic since the question was formulated. So I didn't hear you
Did you
cutting out.
listen, Alex?
Were you able to hear her? Yeah.
No, obviously I've been having some transmission troubles today with the computer. But I think the question has to do is how do you know which emotions are correct? Is that a good summary?
Yes. And how can you know the emotions if you're, because you know that our name is not only ours, is from our ancestors. So if for example I have a cancer and with my emotions, that's a higher level of energy than the physical body, I can cure myself, but these emotions I change all the time, and I can change the salinity, I can change the pH, I can change everything with my emotions. So I don't know how can we control this? How can you know that I'm the right way with these emotions to do something, change in my body, you know?
So we're all looking for proof, and the only proof that we look at is generally speaking in the physicality. So if we can touch it or if we can see it, then we accept that as the proof, but we discount the fact that we were born. So the fact that we were born is proof that there are other forces at play. But you know, the fear is the dominant force that affects our pH. And so when we see the potentiation of fear, you know, I had to wrestle with the concept of being God-fearing. And I thought, well, if you were created by the Creator, First of all, the creator never created anything bad. So that's the first thing. So our assumption that something is good or bad is based on our physical manifestation. So in a way, it's false because it's an insult to the creator. Say, oh, you know, you created something very bad. No, I didn't. You know, so that becomes part of an argument, and as such, you know, we have to understand that it would be rude to even suggest that it's bad. But you are making a choice and saying, well, in my opinion, that is bad, so therefore I will not use that. But in someone else's opinion, that would be very good. And so you have variety. And if you look at the way we do the UBESUS, what are we doing in Gaza? We're delivering the food energy, but we're delivering the food energy for all the people. So will all the people take all the food energy? Or will the people select which food energy that they're going to take? So in other words, just because we are delivering all of the food energy, it doesn't mean that they would take all the food energy. They only take what they need. So there is no extra. There is no bank of food. There's no fridge. You just take what you need and you're good to go. And then leave the rest for the others. But an interesting thing also happens in order for you to maintain your MAGRAV condition, you also have to give energy. And the energy that you give is the energy that you don't need. And we think about the energy that we give and the energy that we don't need as our garbage. And so the garbage for one becomes the gold for the other, doesn't it? Hello?
Did we just lose you for a moment? Alex?
Oh, yeah. Are we back?
Yes, I think you just faded for a second and it reconnected or something happened. Yeah.
Oh, what a day. There's something going on here. This is the fourth or fifth interruption. So I apologize for that.
No problem.
Beyond my control. So where I left off here was to say that if we are giving energy and it's energy that we don't need, then that becomes effectively our garbage. And so are we giving our garbage to someone else? But if we understand that garbage for one is gold for another, and there actually is no such thing as garbage, because if the creator created everything that was good, then there's nothing bad, and the inference that garbage is bad would also be incorrect. So it's just that we don't need it. Why? Why don't we need it? Because we have what we need, and we have to use what we have. So what we don't need, it's not that we're throwing it away, is we're giving it away. And it feeds back into the system. And so someone else who needs that particular energy can get it. Because all the energy on this planet is governed by the law of conservation of energy. So all the energy on this planet is shared by all of us. And no one has a right to get more than the other. That's an inalienable right. It's a natural selection process. So our needs change on a day-to-day basis based on our activity, because it's always energy in motion. So if we consume more energy, then that energy has to be supplemented. And so we have to be very selective as to how we exchange energy. So a direct answer to your question, Claudia, is how do you know? Well, let's say you don't know and you want to run a little test. One of the best things that you can do is do something that is bad for you. And when you get confirmation that that is bad, then you should stop doing that. So that answers your question in terms of what is good and what is bad. And generally speaking, if something is bad, then the opposite is good. Now, that's not to say that there's no in between where something may be better. You don't have to go to the extremes. So you don't have to go to a level of 1 and say, well, to balance off the level of 1, I have to go to the other level of 13. 1 and 13 would be 14. You don't do that. What you can do is there's all sorts of levels in between, and you can pick any level that you want, and all of us are at a different level. And so there's not a commentary of what's good or bad, that's in the eyes of the beholder. But the thing is that life wants to live and life wants to grow. And when we look at the fact that we were a baby at one point and now we're an adult, that means there was a growth. And that growth was a product of the learning. And if that's what we went through, then you can bet that the creator is going through the same process. And so, well, wait a second. How does my growth and how does my learning benefit the creator? Because that is the growth of that particular field. And we are an extension of the creator, and by extension, we are the co-creator. So the growth of us is reflected in the growth of the creator. So therefore, the universe is constantly growing and constantly changing. Well, if the universe is constantly changing, and the law of conservation of energy says that the energy within our universe is constant, how is that possible? That means there's no other energy. So how can there be a beyond? And that's where the anomaly lies. We have to look at our universe and understand that that's part of our transmission spectrum. But there's a beyond, and that is operating under a different transmission spectrum. And so then we have to understand that we can exchange energy between those transmission spectrum. And in order to be able to do that, we have to be able to transition from a lower transmission level to a higher transmission level. And in order to do that, we have to develop our skills. But what we also have to understand is that the higher transmission level is a product of a still higher transmission level. So when we look at the physical transmission level, that's the lowest energy state. And so when we're getting the transition to a higher transmission state, we are only at the midpoint, the balance point. And clearly, to transmit ourselves along this balance point, so in other words, to go from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to 9, we have to have energy coming and going. And if we don't have this energy coming and going, then we can't move. So in order to move better, you can measure the success of your movement by measuring the coming together of your intention and the actual result, and understanding that the result is a manifestation not so much of your intention, but it's a manifestation of the way you are bringing these energies together. And so you have to bring these energies together. So in other words, if you are at a pH of 5, automatically you select a pH of 9. But if you insist and you say, oh, I want a pH of 8, and that's all I want this, and I don't want that. You're basically telling the universe to shut up. And so you get a pH of 13, and guess what? Something's missing. Something is not complete. It's not working. And you say, well, I have full intention, but it's not working. There's nothing wrong with your intention. It's the action. So we need to modify our skills, learn our skills, and understand that the learning that we get teaches us how things work. And it's not a commentary to say, well, that's bad and that's good. That doesn't matter. Sometimes we learn more when we make mistakes. And that's good. I hope I answered your question that way.
Yes, thank you so much. Can I ask another thing? It's a short question. Mr. Cash said that the cosmic rays doesn't get anymore the planet Earth. So doesn't have any place in this Earth that have cosmic rays anymore. That's the truth, or not?
I think he said not all cosmic rays reach the Earth. Depending on the strength of them, we don't have the strength to attract certain cosmic rays, if I remember what he said.
But the pyramids that we have in all places in the Earth could be a
pyramids, yes.
Pyramids, yes, could be a point that have more cosmic rays, attract more.
The attraction manifests itself in physicality there. The cosmic rays that are attracted to the Earth are a product of the field forces that are created by the energies that come from the sun and interact with those of the Earth. And so they create a field of welcome. And those cosmic rays that match those fields then become absorbed. Those cosmic rays that don't match just pass right on through as if we didn't exist. And clearly, when you look at the rest of the universe, you see that there are different places. The most obvious is that there's a difference between the Earth and the Moon, and then there's a difference between the Earth and the Mars. So the cosmic rays that are absorbed by the Earth are not the same ones as they're absorbed by Mars. However, there is an absorption, so the method is the same, and we can change that. However, do we want to change that? Is that absolutely necessary? So, for instance, if we say, well, the pH of 5 is no good and the pH of 9 is very good, we are going to eradicate the pH of 5. So then the entire universe becomes a pH of 9. Is that good? Or is that boring? So what we need to look at is that everything, has its place and is well organized, and it does a natural selection according to what we need. So our earth is our heaven. And so we need to respect that. And we need to understand that we chose this earth before we were born. So that selection process was made before we were born. So the physical selection came after the plasmatic selection. And so the plasmatic selection was fed by these cosmic rays. And so therefore we can say that not all cosmic rays are the same. It's just a category of rays. And so some are absorbed and some pass right through. And we can affect, through our intention, what we absorb. And the reason we can do that is because the cosmic rays are operating at a higher energy state, and we were created from a higher energy state. So for us to work at the lowest energy state is our penalty. And since it's our penalty and we created it, and that's our lesson, we need to now change our point of view and draw the energy from a higher state. So if we were to steal energy from someone else, then we're stealing from the lowest energy state. And if we're drawing energy from the universe, then we're drawing from the highest energy state. And we not only have to learn that lesson, but we have to apply that lesson. And that's where the challenge comes in. And there's no one in a position to offer a better opportunity to rise to that challenge than the knowledge seekers. And the knowledge seekers aren't only the ones within the Keshe Foundation, because the Keshe Foundation is part of the Peace Dome, part of the Plasma Dome, which is part of the Earth space. And all the inhabitants of the Earth space are tuned into the same thing. It's just a question of, are they tuned into that particular channel? And are they, did they turn the radio on to listen and then act accordingly? And so I think we're seeing the transition happening on this planet. And we understand not only do we have a purpose in life as individuals, but the purpose of life has a purpose beyond our tiny little perfect world. So we have to change the game. We have to change the scheme of operations. We cannot operate just within our tiny perfect world and say, well, I'm going to take care of my family and I don't care about your family. Well, if your family is buying goods and services that my family provides, but your family is sick, you won't have the money to buy my goods and services. So I have to care about your welfare. But I can't take responsibility from your welfare because that takes energy away from me. So how can I take care of your welfare? By not cheating, lying, stealing, and killing.
And don't you think if we practice that ethos of thinking good, speaking good, and doing good, wouldn't that attract different energies than if we thought bad, acted bad, and spoke bad? Wouldn't
Yes,
that
of course.
create a balance of wellness by thinking good, speaking good, and acting good? And
Yes, the thing is that is done on a plasmatic level. So this is the part of the problem that we all have. Did I cut out again? No, I'm here.
just for a half a second, if at all.
Okay. So the thing is that we only recognize, what we're saying. Let's say our learning is only here because we come to this meeting. Well, that would be false. Okay. So, and does our learning stop when the meeting is over? Well, that would be false also. Learning is a continuous experience. And so we have to always do a comparative analysis and say, you know, are we better off today than we were yesterday? Is what we've done helping our environment? And have we, through our actions, have we made things better? So that becomes our measuring stick. And if the answer is yes, then you inherently know that that is a good thing. But if the answer is no, then, you know, things have to change. And if you insist on not changing, well, then you're going to get the same results. And so it goes. You can understand that without the understanding of the true nature, the natural selection, without understanding that, our life on this planet would be totally miserable. And I think that is the problem that many of us are having because we're not aware of the new technology. But there are a lot of people who don't know about the new technology, but they are aware. So their awareness is coming through on the soul level. And they are responding in kind because they know they don't need a test. They don't need a pH test. They don't need to see the color. They don't need to see the color of the aura. They know the difference between right and wrong. Okay? Because that is part of the soul. The soul will never lie. So if you understand that the soul is our best friend because the soul is us, and if you lie to yourself, you've really got to be stupid. So let's all be smart and understand that the universe is a benevolent place. That's why we were born. And there's nothing to fear in that regard. We have an inalienable right to be there and to do what we want to do. But what we do not have a right to do is to terrorize others. So there are rules, universal laws, and if we obey them, then not only is life good and our health is good, but everything around us, including our environment, ends up being good. And that's the overall goal. So we understand then that regardless of the age that we're in, we can extend that age. We can extend life on this planet. As long as we're fulfilling our own personal wishes and our own intention, we can remain here. And when we fulfill our intentions, then we can select a different place and a different journey. Over to you, Mark.
Any other questions? Who would like to join the conversation?
That fulfillment, is it determined by us? Because sometimes I think our soul is predetermined on different parts than what we physically do.
So that is absolutely true what you said. The soul actually predetermines everything. So you're trying to navigate through a balanced point. You want to stay away from the extremes. But, you know, it doesn't mean you stay on one lily pad and say, oh, this is my place and I'm so happy I'm going to stay here and do nothing else. Well, you'll have to work in safety, and everybody is, you know, seeking their point of refuge, and everyone has different skills and capabilities. So what is good for me is not necessarily good for you. But what is good for you is predetermined by your soul. That's a fact. And what's good for me is predetermined by my soul. So in both cases, the soul will not lie to you. And then your skill in listening to your soul and reacting in kind is determines your success. And then how do we measure that success? You know, the peace is not just on this planet, the peace is within you as well. You have to have peace of mind, peace of the soul of physicality, peace of the soul of the man. And when you have that, then you have optimum health. And that's what this planet needs. That's what this planet has always wished. It doesn't want, it isn't here to attract sick people. It's attracting healthy people who have the capability of making this planet a better place. It's us who are not listening to that. And I'm as guilty as everybody else. But I think we're all making very, very good progress. And so we're on the path towards peace. And we have to understand that you don't stop the world to say, well, I'm not going to do this. I'm on the path of peace. And now when I'm finished on my path of peace, then I'm going to go back and continue my delinquencies. No, no, it doesn't allow you to do that. If you go into the Ubesu and it helps you with your emotion, and you say, well, thank you, I've improved my health, and then you go back to your wayward ways and say, well, I can go back and do things the way I did it before because I can always go into the Ubesu to fix myself. No, we're not there to remove your responsibility. We're there to help you get back to your point of health so that you can maintain your responsibility and be a universal functionary like all of us. That's the whole purpose. We're not there to take away your responsibility or to allow the continuation of delinquencies. So we're not there to force a situation. We're there to create the proper environment and make it a welcoming for you. And that technology has now fallen to us, and it's a matter for us now to bring that into practical application. And that's what makes this such an exciting time. Thanks, Ike, for your question as well.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you too. Personally, I can tell you how I fix myself on daily basis. If I have challenges with business partners or I have issues or get emotional or see myself getting angry, I go back to the knowledge seekers workshop and listen to different teachings and all that. And I found myself getting back on track. That has always worked for me. That's the way I notice I fix myself. So it's really important that we come to all these classes because it has a way of adding, to the betterment of us.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering, and we haven't heard any firm reports, but the ones that are going into the system in Gaza for feeding every day, do you think they're actually assimilating this process within themselves? So if the system gets turned off, they may be able to provide some of their own wellness or an aspect of wellness or feeding for themselves? I'm thinking the answer is yes. I was just wondering about that. Would you like to comment, anyone, on this? Since they're going in every day and it's been a number of weeks already, do you think people in Gaza or some of them have actually begun to feed themselves?
Mark, could you please repeat the question?
No, about Gaza and people using the feeding system every day. Do you think they're becoming, or it's being assimilated into their structure? again, it's like a training system in so many ways that they could bring. I think we just lost Alex.
I think they are, Mike.
Alex, he's dropped out on all of the systems. I think they are too. I think they're picking up an aspect of it. Let me share the screen. And I was going to play Dr. Gatwa's question that he asked, just to show that the Keshe Foundation isn't just one-dimensional. And that was about the overall assessment of what's happening in the Middle East. Alex is coming back in. Yes.
They taking those feeding, they should be acting like a magnet. And then that gets into transforming this area over there. And that's my hope, you know. So, and my wish, I hope.
Right. I think they're assimilating this absorption of the energies that they'll, if once the system is shut off, because sooner or later it will be shut off, that they would be able to, in a way, some of them may, and we'll have to wait for the actual reports on this, may be able to provide themselves water or food or emotional balancing. It's becoming, it's inculcated within them by using the system every day. Alex, that was my question. I don't know if you heard it. I took the screen. Alex? I see you're here. Let's just see if I can see the participants. Okay, you have a microphone open.
Oh, I don't know what's going on today.
Yeah, no problem.
Particularly bad.
We can expect some of these things as the AI grows more mischievous, if that's the issue.
So I'm going to ask you.
Yep.
To ask a question.
I was saying the people that are using the system in Gaza for feeding, do you think some of them or a group of them are starting to assimilate this process within their own structure? So when the system is turned off, that they will still, perhaps not 100%, but still will be catching on to this ability to provide wellness to themselves in the understanding of absorbing energies for food or emotional balancing. We're going to have to wait for the reports on that, but I'm thinking that this system is actually inculcating this process within their own structure to replicate it after the system is turned off.
Yes, so definitely. The measure is this. Anyone who is involved with the system is enhancing their communication and the response to their intentions coming from the soul. And so it's elevating their abilities and their skill set. And also it's elevating their abilities to contribute. So that becomes automatic. Now, will they accept that in their physicality? That becomes another question. And how can that possibly be manifested? If, let's say, all of them in Gaza, for instance, are elevated, will that affect anybody else or anything else? So if you look at them being part of the peace dome of the world, they have transitioned from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. And that will definitely be conveyed to their leadership. And then that will also be directly conveyed to all those in nearness and proximity to them. Is it enough? The conditions are rough, very, very rough. So I think the challenge is there. However, the method of overcoming that challenge has now elevated by an order of magnitude. So the impact of that is going to be far greater than what we're getting at, shall we say, conventional peace conferences. as you said earlier on, we're not seeing the progress in the peace negotiating of the 5+1, although it's ongoing, still. But if we can get to a higher order of magnitude of energy transition and transmission, then we will be more effective. So that becomes an automatic process. We
I think so.
automatically
Yeah.
then are seeking a balance to that. And this is not something that we just stop everything and expect. There has to be a delay, because we're operating in a delay of consequences in the physicality. The physicality has to catch up. In the old system, there was nothing to catch up to. They were looking at famine only. They were looking at the loss of medicine and everything else only. So now there are alternatives. And whether they acknowledge them in their physicality, they definitely have to acknowledge them in their plasma reality. So that becomes automatic. And so, yes, there will definitely be a residual effect. Thanks, Mark.
Made here, on Tesla, the Model 3 is Tesla's most popular model. It comes in 3 trim levels: rear-wheel drive, long range, and performance. With 4 battery modules, a replacement battery would cost around $20,000 to $28,000. That's 70% of the Model 3's base price. The labor charge may cost you approximately $175 per hour. It can take up to 10 to 13 hours to replace. It was interesting when we were in China, and they have many, many electric cars. I heard there's like 900 electric car companies in China. But we went to one location, the Visa Center, and right next to the Visa Center, which was quite a ways, maybe 20 minutes away from the hotel, they had a battery place where people would come in and their battery would be swapped out. This is what I was told. The battery would be changed in about 15 minutes. Apparently, they have a system there where you come in with a almost dead battery, and you probably have a contract with them. And whenever you'd like, you just put in a new battery and sort of recycle, and they recharge your existing battery. Now, I don't know if that was true, but that's what they said was going on in that building, or we could actually see through the glass. And so you would just drive in there, replace the battery. But as Mr. Kesh said, these batteries, the raw materials, the toxicity level, the problem with the cars burning are all shortening the life of this whole entire electric car industry. But I thought that was very interesting. They'd stay there maybe 15 minutes or so, 10 or 20 minutes, and their battery would be fully topped up because they would slide a new one in. They said it didn't take long at all. So that's an interesting aspect, but it doesn't move us any farther away from the electric car.
Well, that's NEO. That's the company that does the battery swapping.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I hadn't seen that before. I thought everyone had to either charge it at home or find a charger on the street. But I don't have an electric car, so as one of the knowledge seekers said, they're going to save their older car as long as they can to make this change. This is what Mr. Kesh was advising. You may not, the disposal of the existing battery may be quite expensive. So now we're in. Anyone else want to add anything before we close here? As I said, this clip is about 20 minutes, and it shows that the foundation is just not one-dimensional. Of course, Mr. Kesh sort of has an inside track in a way with his different connections to different governments and different security services, but he seems to have a much different view of what's happening there as opposed to what we see in the medias that we normally are accustomed to. So I thought I would play that, but of course, we want you to be proud of the work you do, and to be proud of the person you are, and to be proud of the difference you make. The Kesh Foundation thanks you all. And of course, we again, just bring up these three kings because this is some sort of shielding, some sort of emotional balancing. If you're thinking good and speaking good and acting good, there isn't much that can, in a way, affect you. Even though some great people, I guess, do get cancers and other things and perhaps even to die from them. I know he talked about the C14 being able to cure or to create cancers. So, but I think this idea, which all the Christians missed, of the thinking good, the speaking good, and the doing good are quite powerful forces within our structures. Again, to keep emotional balance, to protection from certain diseases, and to bring wellness to ourselves, and perhaps feeding as well. I think these ideas of thinking, speaking, and doing actually attract certain cosmic rays than if you were thinking bad and acting bad and doing bad or speaking bad, let's say. So a totally different set of energies you'll interact with if you can. Again, it's easier said than done. If you've tried this, you'll find it out. But this is a beautiful shielding and protection overall for emotional balancing and others. And as we know, most of the conditions are created through our emotions. So by practicing and the advice of the three wise men, let's say, who brought the gifts to Christ, I think this is a benefit to all of us. And of course, we'll carry this, as I said earlier, across the universe with us. So thank you for being here and being part of this whole process. We're all bringing the change. We're all carrying a very small corner of this very large carpet. So we're independent, but yet at the same time, we're working together to bring the change. So we want to thank everyone for being here. And as these systems are rolled out, they'll be, I mean, these knowledge seekers workshops will be so full of people wanting to know more, exploring the technology, going to the store. So we'll have plenty of work to do with some of the newer people who are coming into the technology. And I don't think you have to start at the very beginning. If somebody comes in and wants to start at the soul level, that's quite perfect with me.